Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Imagine a world on the brink of destruction where two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, played a deadly game of spies, secrets, and nuclear threats. Every decision could have sparked a global catastrophe, yet most of these stories were never taught in school. Today, we're uncovering the hidden truths of the Cold War, and by the end, you'll see history like never before. The origins of the Cold War are deeply rooted in the aftermath of World War II, a conflict that had left the world in unprecedented turmoil and devastation, and yet it was in this chaos that the seeds of a new and even more dangerous conflict were sown. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies united against the Axis powers, found themselves on opposite sides of a growing ideological chasm, one built on fundamentally different visions of the world and how it should operate. The United States championed a capitalist democracy, a system where private property, free markets, and individual liberties were seen as the path to prosperity and global stability. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, believed in a communist model where the state controlled the means of production, wealth was redistributed, and a single, party system was necessary to maintain social order and achieve equality. These conflicting ideologies were not just theoretical disagreements. They influenced every policy, every diplomatic maneuver, and every strategic decision, creating an environment ripe for mistrust and confrontation. As World War II drew to a close, Europe was left in ruins. Cities lay in rubble, millions of people were dead or displaced, and governments had collapsed under the weight of occupation and war. In the midst of this devastation, the question of who would control post-war Europe became paramount. The Soviet Union had suffered immense losses during the war, losing tens of millions of people, and its leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, was determined to secure the nation against any future threats. From the Soviet perspective, the devastation of the war was proof that the West could not be trusted to guarantee security, and establishing friendly governments in Eastern Europe was a matter of survival. The Red Army's presence in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary was not just military occupation, but a strategic buffer, a way to prevent any future invasions from the West, and to project Soviet influence across the continent. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the war in a position of unprecedented strength. Its industrial base was intact, its military had proven decisive, and it possessed nuclear weapons that gave it unmatched power on the global stage. Yet, rather than seeking isolation, American policymakers were determined to shape a post-war world that would prevent the spread of totalitarian ideologies and ensure economic stability. The United States was particularly concerned about the potential for communist expansion, interpreting Soviet actions in Eastern Europe not as security measures, but as a deliberate attempt to spread a system that threatened American interests and values. This fear of communist expansion would come to define U.S. foreign policy for decades, shaping military strategies, economic aid programs, and diplomatic negotiations in a bid to contain the influence of the Soviet Union. The tension between these two powers was evident almost immediately after the war. Conferences such as Yalta and Potsdam, intended to shape post-war Europe and determine the fate of Germany, were fraught with disagreement and suspicion. While on the surface leaders like Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin appeared to cooperate, behind closed doors, mutual mistrust was growing. The United States was wary of Stalin's insistence on controlling Eastern Europe, interpreting it as evidence of expansionist ambitions, while the Soviet Union was skeptical of American plans for economic reconstruction and the promotion of democratic governments, seeing these as threats to Soviet security and influence. Each decision, each negotiation, each delayed agreement further deepened the divide, and what had been a wartime alliance began to unravel into suspicion, fear, and ultimately rivalry. The ideological battle was not confined to Europe. Globally, nations were emerging from colonial rule or facing the challenges of reconstruction, and both the United States and the Soviet Union saw opportunities to shape the future according to their respective visions. In Asia, countries like China were engulfed in civil war, with communist and nationalist forces vying for control, while in the Middle East, newly independent states were navigating their identities amid competing pressures from superpowers. Every region became a potential arena for influence, a chessboard where the United States and the Soviet Union moved pieces not through direct confrontation, but through political pressure, economic aid, and strategic alliances. The Cold War was as much about ideas as it was about military power, and each superpower sought to present its system as the model for the modern world. One of the earliest manifestations of American concern over Soviet intentions was the Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947. This policy marked a clear commitment by the United States to support nations resisting communist pressure, signaling that America would take an active role in global affairs and that it would not tolerate the expansion of Soviet influence. While framed as a moral and ideological commitment, the doctrine also had strategic implications, as it effectively drew a line in the sand, defining the world in terms of allies and adversaries, free nations and those under threat. In response, the Soviet Union intensified its efforts to consolidate control over Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states and strengthening the grip of communist parties across the region. The result was a tense standoff, a world divided not by geography alone, but by ideology, suspicion, and the ever-present fear of conflict. Economic factors also played a significant role in shaping the early Cold War. The United States, recognizing the devastation in Europe and the potential for instability to foster communist movements, launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, providing billions of dollars in aid for reconstruction. The plan was not purely humanitarian. It was a strategic effort to rebuild Europe under democratic and capitalist principles, creating markets for American goods and stabilizing societies in a way that would prevent communist uprisings. The Soviet Union, predictably, rejected aid and viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to undermine its influence, deepening the economic and political divide between East and West. Europe, once united by war, now became the front line of a new and invisible struggle, with the Iron Curtain descending across the continent, separating societies, families, and futures along ideological lines. The origins of the Cold War were therefore a complex interplay of ideology, security concerns, economic strategy, and personal mistrust among leaders. It was not a war in the conventional sense, with armies meeting on the battlefield, but a war of perception, influence, and preparation, where every decision mattered and every misstep could have global consequences. The United States and the Soviet Union, emerging from the largest conflict in human history, were both determined to shape the world in their own image, and in doing so, set the stage for decades of tension, espionage, and confrontation that would define the latter half of the 20th century. Once the Cold War began, it quickly became clear that this was not a conflict that would be fought with conventional armies facing each other on a battlefield. Instead, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a race for technological and military supremacy, a competition that came to be defined by the accumulation of weapons of mass destruction and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became central to this struggle. Both sides realized that any direct conflict between them could trigger a nuclear war that would wipe out millions, if not billions, of people, making restraint as important as aggression in this tense period of history. The arms race wasn't just about having the most powerful weapons. It was a psychological battle, a demonstration of strength, and a warning to the other side that any act of aggression would come at an unbearable cost. The story begins with the United States' unprecedented use of atomic bombs in 1945, a decisive factor in ending World War II, but also a clear demonstration of the power America now possessed. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed the world, and particularly the Soviet Union, that the United States had weapons capable of instant and total destruction. For Soviet leaders, this was both alarming and motivating. Stalin understood that to maintain the security of his nation and ensure the survival of communism, the Soviet Union could not remain defenseless in the face of such overwhelming power. The development of their own nuclear arsenal became a priority, and by 1949 the Soviets had successfully detonated their first atomic bomb, ending America's brief monopoly on nuclear weapons and signaling that the stakes of the Cold War had escalated dramatically. From there, the race accelerated. Hydrogen bombs, far more powerful than the initial atomic weapons, were developed and tested by both superpowers, each trying to outdo the other in destructive capability. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in 1952, followed closely by the Soviet Union in 1953. These tests were not simply technical achievements. They were messages, broadcasts of power designed to intimidate, assert dominance, and influence global politics without firing a single shot in anger. Each explosion, each test, was both a triumph of science and a terrifying reminder of the human capacity for destruction. The world watched as cities that once seemed safe could theoretically be destroyed in minutes, and the concept of war itself began to change from traditional combat to the potential for instant annihilation. Missile technology further transformed the arms race. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, allowed nuclear weapons to be launched across continents with frightening accuracy. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles added a layer of stealth and unpredictability, creating a situation where neither side could ever feel completely safe from a retaliatory strike. The United States developed the Atlas and Titan missile programs, while the Soviet Union created the R-7 and subsequent missile systems. Each successful launch was not only a technological achievement but a political statement, a demonstration of power meant to ensure that no one could contemplate a first strike without facing inevitable destruction. The arms race wasn't limited to nuclear weapons alone. Both nations invested heavily in conventional military forces, aircraft, and defense systems, always mindful that technological superiority could shift the balance of power. Air defense networks, radar systems, and early warning systems were constructed with meticulous precision, ensuring that even the faintest hint of an attack could be detected and countered. This constant state of preparation created a tense environment in which even accidents or misinterpretations could spark global panic. Incidents like the false alarms triggered by satellites or radar glitches became terrifying reminders of how close the world could come to catastrophe without any actual intention of war. Public perception played a key role in the arms race as well. Governments on both sides understood that the accumulation of weapons was not just about strategic advantage, but also about maintaining domestic and international credibility. In the United States, civil defense programs educated citizens on how to survive a nuclear attack, while propaganda emphasized the moral imperative of resisting communism. In the Soviet Union, citizens were reassured that their leadership was building a shield of protection against capitalist aggression. The arms race thus became both a psychological and political tool, shaping public opinion and maintaining a sense of urgency that kept societies focused on the threat posed by the other superpower. Nuclear testing and development were also intertwined with espionage and intelligence efforts. Both the CIA and the KGB were constantly monitoring the other side, trying to determine the capabilities, intentions, and weaknesses of their adversary. High-altitude reconnaissance flights, like the U-2 missions over the Soviet Union, were not only risky but crucial in gathering information about missile silos, production facilities, and nuclear testing sites. Spy networks infiltrated laboratories, industrial plants, and military installations, sometimes at the cost of the lives of those involved. The arms race, in many ways, was as much about knowledge as it was about firepower. Without accurate intelligence, decisions could be dangerously flawed, and the balance of terror could collapse under miscalculation. One of the most frightening aspects of the arms race was how it made global diplomacy dependent on the threat of annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a direct result of this buildup of weapons, bringing the world closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, capable of striking the United States within minutes, triggered a tense standoff that lasted 13 days. Both sides had the capability to destroy the other, and yet, through a combination of diplomacy, secret negotiations, and cautious restraint, catastrophe was narrowly avoided. The crisis highlighted the inherent danger of the arms race. The more weapons accumulated, the greater the risk that human error or misjudgment could lead to global destruction. Beyond immediate military and political concerns, the arms race had profound economic and social implications. Massive investments in weapons programs, research, and infrastructure diverted resources from social development and economic growth in both nations. Entire industries were shaped around the production of missiles, bombs, and defense systems, creating a complex interdependence between government, industry, and science. At the same time, the psychological impact on civilians, constantly aware of the potential for sudden annihilation, influenced culture, media, and education, shaping generations to live under a persistent cloud of fear. Despite the danger and the cost, the arms race continued for decades, driven by competition, mistrust, and the desire to maintain strategic advantage. It was a conflict without conventional battles, fought with technology, intelligence, and the ever-present shadow of nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that in this new kind of war, victory was measured not by territory gained or battles won, but by the ability to prevent the other from gaining an advantage and to demonstrate the capacity to respond to any aggression. The balance of terror defined international relations, shaping policies, alliances, and crises across the globe, and its influence would be felt long after the first bombs were built and the first missiles launched. As the Cold War intensified, it became clear that direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union would be catastrophic, and so both superpowers turned to more subtle, indirect methods to pursue their goals. One of the most critical arenas of this struggle was espionage, a shadowy and secretive battlefield where spies, double agents, and intelligence agencies operated in a world hidden from public view, but with consequences that could change the course of history. The CIA, created in 1947, and the Soviet KGB, formalized in the years following the war, became the instruments through which each side sought to gather information, sabotage the other's efforts, and influence events in regions far from their own borders. Espionage during the Cold War was not only about stealing secrets, it was about shaping perceptions, manipulating governments, and gaining any advantage possible in a conflict where the stakes were global survival. Spies became the unseen warriors of this era. Some operated in plain sight, embedded in governments, corporations, and scientific institutions, gathering critical intelligence about military plans, nuclear programs, and political strategies. Others moved in the shadows, risking their lives to deliver information across enemy lines, often at the cost of capture, imprisonment, or execution. Cases like those of Klaus Fuchs, the German, born physicist who passed atomic secrets to the Soviets, or Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer turned KGB mole, reveal how deeply the war of intelligence penetrated society and how a single individual could have a profound impact on the balance of power. The stakes were so high that each piece of information could influence nuclear strategies, diplomatic negotiations, and even the outcome of conflicts in distant parts of the world. Intelligence gathering wasn't confined to human agents. Technology became a crucial component of espionage, with reconnaissance aircraft, satellites, and signal interception playing an ever-growing role. The U-2 spy plane missions over Soviet territory allowed the United States to monitor missile sites and military installations, while satellites provided imagery that could confirm or refute intelligence claims. On the Soviet side, intercepting communications, monitoring diplomatic channels, and recruiting informants across the globe were key strategies to stay ahead. Every new technological development was immediately assessed for its potential intelligence value, and both sides invested enormous resources to ensure that no secret, no matter how well guarded, remained beyond their reach. Yet, espionage alone could not win the Cold War. Both superpowers also engaged in proxy wars, conflicts fought indirectly through other nations, where American and Soviet influence was projected into regions around the world without risking direct confrontation. Korea was one of the earliest and most significant examples. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, the United States, under the auspices of the United Nations, intervened to support the South, while the Soviet Union and China backed the North. The Korean War was a brutal, conventional conflict, but it was also a clear manifestation of the Cold War logic. The world was divided, and every regional conflict could be a testing ground for the superpowers' ideologies, weapons, and strategies. Millions of lives were lost, and while the war ended in an armistice rather than a formal peace, it set the stage for decades of tension on the Korean peninsula and demonstrated the high cost of proxy conflicts. Vietnam became another central theater in the Cold War struggle. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, committed vast resources to support South Vietnam against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. What began as a regional conflict escalated into one of the most controversial and devastating wars of the 20th century. Guerrilla warfare, heavy bombing campaigns, and immense civilian suffering highlighted the indirect nature of Cold War conflicts, where ideology dictated intervention and military engagement became an instrument of political strategy. For the Soviet Union, providing aid, weapons, and advisors to North Vietnam was a way to expand influence and challenge American hegemony without risking a direct confrontation that could escalate to nuclear war. Afghanistan, in the 1980s, became yet another proxy battlefield, as the Soviet Union intervened to support a communist government facing a rebellion, while the United States, along with regional allies, supplied weapons, funding, and training to the Mujahideen fighters resisting Soviet forces. This conflict drained resources, created long-term instability, and had consequences that would ripple through global politics for decades. Proxy wars like Afghanistan were particularly significant because they demonstrated the indirect but devastating human cost of the Cold War, as millions of civilians were caught in the crossfire of a struggle between powers half a world away. Espionage and proxy conflicts were also tightly linked. Intelligence operations often informed military strategies, guided the flow of weapons, and helped superpowers choose which conflicts to intervene in or support. Decisions about which factions to back, which governments to influence, and which operations to fund were made with careful consideration of intelligence reports, covert assessments, and risk analysis. Sometimes these operations succeeded brilliantly, shifting the course of conflicts or toppling governments. Other times they failed spectacularly, leading to embarrassment, loss of life, and increased tensions between the superpowers. The invisible hand of spies and covert operatives thus shaped the world in profound ways, demonstrating that much of the Cold War was fought not on traditional battlefields, but in shadows and secret rooms where knowledge and deception were the most potent weapons. The human dimension of espionage and proxy wars was also critical. Ordinary people, whether soldiers, civilians, or informants, often bore the brunt of these conflicts. Families were divided, communities destabilized, and entire nations subjected to policies and decisions made thousands of miles away. The consequences of espionage and proxy engagements were felt in everyday life, from the fear of nuclear retaliation to the direct impact of foreign-funded conflicts. Children grew up under the constant threat of invasion or occupation. Societies were polarized by ideological pressures, and political landscapes were reshaped by outside influence. The Cold War, in this sense, was not just a struggle between nations. It was a struggle that touched the lives of millions, influencing the course of history on a deeply personal level. Cultural and psychological impacts also played a role in espionage and proxy conflicts. Governments used propaganda to support their intelligence operations, portraying the other side as both a mortal enemy and a dangerous ideological threat. Films, literature, and media broadcasts depicted spies as heroes or villains, often blurring the line between reality and fiction, and reinforcing the narratives that justified intervention and covert operations. Citizens were encouraged to remain vigilant, suspicious of outsiders, and loyal to their nation's cause, creating an atmosphere of tension and alertness that extended into everyday life. Through all of these mechanisms, spying, intelligence, covert operations, and proxy wars, the Cold War became a global struggle in which battles were fought quietly, often invisibly, yet with consequences that were profound, immediate, and far-reaching. It was a war of strategy, deception, and indirect influence, where victory was measured not in territory captured, but in control over perception, resources, and global alignments. And while the superpowers never faced each other directly on a full-scale battlefield, the conflicts they influenced and the intelligence they gathered shaped international relations, altered political landscapes, and left a legacy of mistrust, caution, and awareness of the hidden forces that can determine the fate of nations. The Cold War wasn't just fought with weapons, spies, or proxy wars. It was also fought in the minds of people across the globe, in classrooms, theaters, laboratories, and even living rooms. Culture and technology became arenas for competition, where each superpower sought to demonstrate not just military might, but the superiority of its entire way of life. For the United States, capitalism and democracy were ideals worth promoting, while the Soviet Union wanted to show that socialism and communism could produce a modern, thriving society. This struggle manifested in movies, literature, music, education, scientific achievements, and technological innovation, creating a pervasive atmosphere in which even daily life became a subtle battlefield of ideology. Hollywood became one of the most powerful tools of the Cold War. Films were not just entertainment, they were instruments of persuasion and influence. American cinema often portrayed Soviet agents as villains, communist societies as oppressive and sinister, and the United States as a bastion of freedom, ingenuity, and moral clarity. Spy thrillers, war films, and even science fiction movies carried underlying messages that reinforced the American world. Encouraging viewers to see the global struggle in clear moral terms. Democracy versus tyranny, freedom versus control. The reach of these cultural products extended far beyond the United States, as films were exported and viewed worldwide, subtly shaping international perceptions of both superpowers. The Soviet Union also recognized the importance of culture as a means of influence. Art, theater, literature, and film were mobilized to promote socialist values and demonstrate the achievements of the communist system. Writers, directors, and artists were encouraged, or pressured, to produce works that highlighted the strength of collective society, the heroism of workers and soldiers, and the technological and scientific prowess of the nation. Ballet, classical music, and other cultural achievements became part of a broader campaign to show that the Soviet Union could compete with the West, not only in politics and military power, but also in intellectual and artistic accomplishments. Culture became a subtle weapon, and every exhibition, performance, or publication was infused with political meaning. Education played a critical role in this ideological competition. In the United States, children were taught about the dangers of communism from a young age, learning about the threats posed by the Soviet Union and the importance of vigilance and loyalty to democratic ideals. Schools incorporated lessons on civic responsibility, the virtues of capitalism, and the significance of technological and scientific achievement, framing the Cold War as a struggle that involved every citizen, not just policymakers. The Soviet Union similarly emphasized education that promoted loyalty to the party, technological expertise, and socialist values, ensuring that the next generation of citizens and scientists were deeply invested in the survival and success of the communist system. These educational efforts helped shape entire generations, instilling both fear of the other side and pride in their own nation's ideology. Technology became one of the most visible arenas of competition. The space race, in particular, captured global attention and became a symbol of ideological superiority. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, it shocked the world and demonstrated that the Soviets could achieve remarkable technological feats. This success wasn't merely about science. It was a powerful statement about the capabilities of the communist system, suggesting that a society organized under socialism could rival or surpass capitalist nations in innovation. The United States responded with determination, launching its own satellite programs, creating NASA, and committing enormous resources to ensure that America would not fall behind. Every launch, every mission, every step toward the moon became part of the ideological struggle, a way of proving whose system could produce greater knowledge, more progress, and superior achievement. Scientific achievement extended beyond space exploration. Nuclear technology, missile development, computer science, and medical research all became domains in which each superpower sought to demonstrate its competence and assert dominance. Breakthroughs in these fields were celebrated not only as technical victories, but also as ideological triumphs, evidence that one system was more effective, innovative, and capable than the other. The race to develop nuclear power, satellites, and advanced military technologies reflected a broader understanding that control over technology equaled global influence, and that scientific prestige could translate into both strategic advantage and cultural respect. Media and propaganda reinforced these competitions. News broadcasts, radio programs, and print media were all carefully managed to promote national achievements and highlight the other side's shortcomings. In the United States, coverage of Soviet failures in agriculture, industry, or space technology was emphasized to reinforce narratives of superiority, while Soviet media highlighted American racial inequality, social unrest, or political scandals to criticize capitalism. This constant exchange of messaging created a world in which perception was nearly as important as reality, and where cultural and technological successes were leveraged as evidence in an ideological debate that spanned the globe. Sports, too, became a symbolic battlefield. International competitions, including the Olympics, were stages on which each superpower could demonstrate the physical strength, discipline, and vitality of its people. Medal counts, athletic achievements, and even individual performances were imbued with political meaning. Every victory was presented as proof that one system produced stronger, more capable citizens, while every defeat was analyzed for what it suggested about societal weaknesses. Athletes became ambassadors, sometimes unwitting, in a conflict that extended far beyond politics, into every arena of human achievement. The cultural and technological competition also had profound psychological effects on the populations of both nations. Citizens lived with a dual sense of pride and fear, celebrating their country's achievements while remaining acutely aware of the ongoing threat posed by their rival. Children grew up idolizing astronauts, scientists, and athletes, internalizing the importance of national success in every endeavor, while adults balanced admiration for technological marvels with anxiety about nuclear weapons, espionage, and geopolitical crises. This environment shaped public consciousness in ways that affected not only domestic policy and societal norms, but also personal identity and cultural outlook, creating generations who experienced the Cold War not only as a political struggle, but as a pervasive aspect of daily life. Ultimately, the cultural and technological competition of the Cold War demonstrated that power was not limited to armies or weapons. Influence could be wielded through art, education, scientific achievement, media, and even sports. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that convincing the world of the superiority of their system could yield long-term strategic advantages, creating alliances, fostering loyalty, and shaping perceptions across continents. Every exhibition, experiment, broadcast, or cultural export became part of a larger, ongoing contest, where victory was measured not only in geopolitical terms, but in the hearts and minds of people around the world. A competition that was as invisible as it was impactful, and as pervasive as it was enduring. As the Cold War progressed into the 1970s and 1980s, the world began to see signs that the decades-long confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union could eventually come to an end, though no one could predict exactly how or when. The Soviet Union, once a seemingly unshakable superpower, was facing mounting internal pressures. Its centrally planned economy, long focused on heavy industry and military production, was struggling to provide for the basic needs of its citizens. Shortages of consumer goods, stagnating wages, and declining productivity eroded confidence in the system, and while the government maintained tight control over political expression, discontent was growing quietly in cities and towns across the country. Meanwhile, the costs of competing in the global arena, supporting allies, engaging in proxy wars, and maintaining a vast nuclear arsenal placed immense strain on the Soviet economy, making it increasingly clear that the status quo could not be sustained indefinitely. At the same time, leadership changes in both superpowers began to open doors for negotiation and reform. In the United States, presidents from Nixon to Reagan adopted a mix of pressure and diplomacy, understanding that sustained engagement could encourage change within the Soviet system without risking catastrophic conflict. Reagan, in particular, recognized the power of both confrontation and dialogue, investing in defense programs that challenged Soviet capabilities while also engaging in a series of summits and negotiations with Soviet leaders. On the Soviet side, Mikhail Gorbachev emerged as a transformative figure, introducing policies of glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, which sought to modernize the economy and liberalize society. Gorbachev's willingness to engage with the West, reduce military expenditures, and allow greater political freedom signaled a fundamental shift in Soviet strategy and created conditions for an unprecedented thaw in the Cold War. One of the most visible and symbolic signs of the Cold War's impending end was the transformation of Eastern Europe. Countries that had long been under the tight control of Moscow began to assert their independence, often through popular movements that demanded political freedom, economic reform, and greater autonomy. Poland's Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, became a beacon of resistance, demonstrating the power of organized civil society to challenge entrenched authority. In East Germany, mass protests and a growing exodus of citizens seeking freedom in the West culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, an event that became one of the most iconic moments in modern history. The collapse of the wall was more than a physical dismantling of a barrier. It was a symbolic victory for democracy, freedom, and the idea that entrenched systems, no matter how powerful, could be challenged and transformed by the will of the people. Other Eastern European nations followed similar paths. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all experienced waves of political change, often accompanied by public demonstrations, negotiations, and, in some cases, violent upheaval. The Soviet Union, preoccupied with domestic challenges and guided by Gorbachev's more conciliatory foreign policy, chose not to intervene militarily as it had in earlier decades, signaling a new era in international relations. This restraint marked a departure from the decades of coercion and control that had characterized the Cold War, and it allowed Eastern Europe to redefine its political and economic future without the looming threat of Soviet invasion. The economic dimension of the Cold War's end was equally significant. The Soviet Union's struggles to sustain its military and industrial commitments revealed the unsustainability of a system focused primarily on defense and heavy industry at the expense of consumer welfare, innovation, and economic flexibility. By contrast, the United States and other Western nations demonstrated that robust economies, technological innovation, and integration into global trade networks could provide resilience and long-term influence. The contrast between stagnation and growth became increasingly apparent, reinforcing the perception that change was not only inevitable but necessary. International economic engagement, investment, and aid programs, coupled with the pressures of competition and domestic demand for reform, accelerated the pace of transformation, making the collapse of centralized, authoritarian control in the Soviet bloc more likely. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union itself began to unravel. Nationalist movements within its constituent republics gained momentum, challenging the authority of the central government in Moscow and demanding independence. The Baltic states, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, led the charge, declaring sovereignty and asserting their right to self-determination. Other republics such as Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia followed suit, further weakening the cohesion of the Soviet system. Attempts to maintain control through political or military means were largely unsuccessful, as both internal dissent and external pressures combined to make the old order untenable. By December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, marking the definitive end of the Cold War and reshaping the global balance of power almost overnight. The end of the Cold War did not mean that the world suddenly became peaceful or that the challenges of international relations disappeared. Rather, it marked a shift from a bipolar world dominated by two superpowers to a more complex, multipolar system where influence was distributed among multiple nations and non-state actors. The United States emerged as the primary global leader, but it now faced the task of managing new alliances, economic relationships, and regional conflicts without the clear framework of the Cold War. Former Soviet republics navigated the transition from authoritarian control to independence, experimenting with democracy, market economies, and political pluralism, often with varying degrees of success and significant social and economic upheaval. The legacy of the Cold War continues to influence international politics, security policies, and cultural perceptions. Many of the alliances, treaties, and military structures created during the Cold War remain in place, shaping decisions about defense, trade, and diplomacy. NATO, for example, continues to play a central role in European security, while former Soviet states maintain complex relationships with Russia and the broader international community. The lessons of espionage, nuclear deterrence, and indirect conflict inform current approaches to global security, reminding leaders that power, influence, and strategy often operate in ways that are not immediately visible but have profound consequences. On a cultural level, the Cold War left lasting imprints on society. Literature, film, music, and art from the period reflect the anxieties, fears, and aspirations of generations who lived under the constant shadow of potential conflict. Public consciousness was shaped by the knowledge that global survival depended on both the actions of nations and the engagement of ordinary citizens. Science and technology, accelerated by the competition between superpowers, continue to drive innovation, while educational systems around the world were influenced by the emphasis on STEM fields, strategic thinking, and global awareness. The Cold War demonstrated that ideology, culture, and technology are not peripheral to history, but central to the way societies evolve, compete, and interact. In reflecting on the end of the Cold War, it is clear that it was not merely the collapse of a political system, but a transformation of the international order, a reshaping of global priorities, and a reminder of the resilience of human societies. It illustrated that conflicts driven by ideology, fear, and power could persist for decades without direct confrontation, and that the resolution of such conflicts often required both leadership and the collective will of people within and beyond national borders. The consequences continue to echo in global politics, shaping diplomacy, defense strategies, and cultural understanding, while the stories, lessons, and experiences of those decades remain a vital part of the historical consciousness that informs how nations and individuals navigate a world still influenced by the legacies of this extraordinary period in history. While the Cold War is often remembered as a struggle between superpowers, its impact was truly global, shaping societies and governments thousands of miles from Washington and Moscow. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America became arenas where the ideological battle played out in unexpected and sometimes devastating ways. In many instances, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't intervene directly, but supported local factions, governments, and revolutionary movements to tilt the balance of power. In Latin America, for example, Nations like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Chile became focal points of Cold War maneuvering. Fidel Castro's rise in Cuba after 1959 triggered decades of tension with the United States, leading to events like the Bay of Pigs invasion, an operation intended to overthrow Castro that ended in failure, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. These events illustrated that the ideological contest wasn't confined to textbooks or speeches. It had tangible, sometimes catastrophic effects on the lives of ordinary people. In Asia, the Cold War played out through a series of conflicts that shaped the modern history of the continent. The Korean War was one of the first major confrontations, leaving the peninsula divided along the 38th parallel in a frozen conflict that continues to this day. Vietnam became another flashpoint where decades of intervention and military escalation by the United States aimed to contain communism, yet ultimately resulted in a war that cost millions of lives, created lasting trauma, and challenged the notion of American military supremacy. Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the United States supported the Mujahideen against Soviet forces, became another stage where foreign intervention had long-term consequences, eventually contributing to instability that persists into the 21st century. These conflicts demonstrate that while the superpowers rarely engaged each other directly, their influence reverberated worldwide, leaving legacies of both destruction and transformation. Technology, which had been a key aspect of cultural and military competition, also had far-reaching implications for global society. The space race, for example, was not merely about national prestige. It pushed scientific knowledge and innovation in ways that continue to affect modern life. Satellites developed during this period laid the foundation for modern communication, weather forecasting, and GPS technology, while advances in computer science, aerospace engineering, and nuclear physics influenced industries far beyond military applications. The investment in research and development by both superpowers created a ripple effect, fostering education, innovation, and infrastructure that would help shape economies and societies long after the Cold War ended. The psychological and cultural dimensions of the Cold War cannot be overstated. For ordinary citizens, living under the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation created a pervasive sense of tension and urgency. Air raid drills, fallout shelters, and public service campaigns in the United States trained people to imagine the worst-case scenario, while Soviet citizens were similarly made aware of the global stakes and the need for vigilance. Films, literature, and television programs reinforced these anxieties, often portraying spies, nuclear threats, and ideological battles in dramatized ways that made the abstract very real. Music, fashion, and even sports reflected ideological undercurrents, subtly shaping how people understood their place in the world and the conflict that dominated international relations. At the political level, diplomacy during the Cold War was a delicate balancing act. Leaders had to navigate the fine line between confrontation and compromise, knowing that any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Summit meetings between American presidents and Soviet leaders became highly charged events, where personal rapport, public messaging, and behind-the-scenes negotiations all influenced the global trajectory. Treaties such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, were landmark efforts to manage the competition for nuclear superiority, demonstrating that even in a period defined by suspicion, careful negotiation and dialogue could prevent disaster. These diplomatic efforts required skill, patience, and often extraordinary courage, as both sides sought to project strength while avoiding actions that could trigger war. One of the most interesting aspects of the Cold War is how it influenced global culture and identity. People in non-aligned nations countries that sought to remain independent from both the United States and the Soviet Union had to navigate the pressures of ideological alignment while pursuing their own national interests. Leaders in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East often leveraged Cold War rivalries to secure aid, technology, or political recognition, while populations dealt with the consequences of being pawns in a larger game. This dynamic created a world in which local struggles, aspirations, and movements were inseparable from the global superpower contest, demonstrating that the Cold War was not just a battle of governments, but a force that shaped entire continents and generations. Espionage, which had been critical to the Cold War from the beginning, evolved alongside technology and culture, influencing public perception and government policy. High-profile spy cases, such as those involving Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, or the Cambridge Five in the UK, captured public imagination and reinforced the sense of an invisible but constant threat. Intelligence was no longer simply about battlefield advantage. It shaped diplomacy, influenced economic decisions, and informed public narratives about the other side. Governments learned that controlling information could be as important as controlling territory, and this emphasis on perception continues to influence international relations today. The environmental and social consequences of the Cold War are also part of its legacy. Nuclear testing left contamination in remote areas, creating health and ecological problems that persisted for decades. Military industrialization shaped landscapes, economies, and labor markets, while arms production and experimentation consumed vast amounts of natural resources. Meanwhile, the experience of living under constant threat shaped societies psychologically, creating a culture of caution, vigilance, and, in some cases, paranoia that left lasting impressions on citizens of both superpowers and their allies. Even after the political conflict ended, the human and environmental costs of this prolonged global struggle remained evident. Finally, the end of the Cold War did not erase its influence, rather it transformed it. The dissolution of the Soviet Union created new states, new alliances, and new challenges, while the United States emerged as the primary global leader, but inherited the responsibility of managing a world shaped by decades of ideological competition. The lessons of the Cold War about the dangers of unchecked escalation, the power of ideology, and the importance of diplomacy, intelligence, and technological innovation continue to resonate in contemporary international relations. Conflicts today, whether in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, are often influenced by Cold War-era policies, alliances, and experiences, demonstrating that history is never truly past, but remains a living force shaping the present and future.